Will voting machines in the 2024 election get hacked? It's a fair question to ask because undoubtedly there's going to be chaos and shenanigans in the next 24 hours. As I record this, it's November 4th, Monday, November 4th, 2024. Tomorrow is election day in the United States, and there's going to be shenanigans. You know it. I know it. There's shenanigans. There's always shenanigans. So how reasonable is it to assume that there will be hackery going on with our voting equipment, with the equipment that tabulates the votes, that records the votes, that transmits the votes, that counts the votes? How likely is it? Well, it's near 100%. It's as close to a certainty as you can get without the event actually having happened yet and having been confirmed. Like, it's just so obvious that there will be hacked voting equipment. It's in significant numbers tomorrow, if not already, that it almost boggles the mind that anyone on earth could say otherwise. I'm going to walk you through exactly why that is so astoundingly obvious to anyone who's worked in computer security for any length of time. It's just ridiculously obvious. And I also want to point out as we go, if you come across news stories such as this one from ABC News, where they are trying to explain to you how it's just not possible to hack voting equipment. Elections are secure, and everyone who says that you can hack computers is a conspiracy theorist. Anyone who says that, well, they either have absolutely no idea what they're talking about when it comes to computer security, or they're lying to you. So let's go through this right now, because there's going to be a lot of this discussion going on, and it's important to have this information. Now, first, why exactly? Why exactly is this going to happen? There are a huge number of targets, right? An absolutely huge number of targets in the United States for hacking parts of the election, hacking the voter data, hacking how people vote themselves, hacking the final tally, etc. So how many attack vectors are we talking about? How many open computers are we talking about that we could have modified here? Well, as of the 2016 election, there were 116,000 polling places in the United States. Now, there's more since then, but and within those 100,000 plus polling locations, they had nearly 1 million people, volunteers, working on those votes, right? Working, those poll workers, trying to staff all of that, 1 million of them. And they regularly reported that they were woefully understaffed. So you have exhausted, tired, poorly trained volunteers, 1 million of them, across 100,000 polling locations throughout the United States. Well, now, what about the equipment at those polling locations, staffed by those 1 million exhausted volunteers? Well, close to 80% as of 4 years ago. This is according to the MIT Election Data Lab, which you can get at electionlab.mit.edu. As of 4 years ago, almost 80% of those votes were tabulated by optical scanners. What are those? Those are those Scantron sheets you used in high school, right? The fill in the bubble scan sheets. Various kinds, but that's those. Most of the tallying is done by optical scanners. Now, those take a wide variety of forms, including standalone air-gapped units that just you stick in a batch and it flip, and it gives you a tally. Sometimes it'll print it out and sometimes display it too, depending on how fancy the counter is. Some of them are directly connected to a single laptop or desktop computer that then tabulates it in software. In some cases, they're actually network connected and it tabulates it over Wi-Fi. That's not a joke. That's a real thing. It's varying, right? It varies depending on your precinct and your state because things are all over the map. Now, that's roughly 80%. Most of the rest of the precincts and the polling locations in the United States use electronic voting equipment where you vote with a touch screen and it records your vote right there, tabulates it right there, and in many cases actually transmits it from there, right? It makes it all electronic. Those particular voting machines are made by a handful of companies, and a lot of those machines are running Windows. Immediately, a whole bunch of you go, well, there you go. This election is definitely getting hacked. And yep, I mean, this is just us being honest with ourselves about what we've got. So how many hackable machines, right, are we talking about here? Now, even the most simple, basic optical scanners are hackable. Just to give you an example here, there's a picture floating around on social media right now, supposedly coming out of Kentucky, where many of the ballot printers are printing out base ballots, have printed out base ballots where the Harris Waltz ticket already has a little black dot in the area that you're supposed to fill in for the optical scanner to read. Now, if you're voting for Harris Waltz, this is fine because you just fill in the rest of that square that already has a little dot in it and you're good to go. However, if you're voting for another candidate, your vote may actually get tossed out, at least on the initial count, because you will now have an optical scan that grabs two results, one for the one you filled in, and well, that little dot for many of these scanners will say, oh, you also voted for Harris, so therefore you voted for nobody, and it kicks out your ballot, thus nullifying your vote. So there's a wide variety of ways to hack these sorts of machines, even the more simple ones that are out there. But there's a wide variety of other types of computers involved here. We're talking PDAs. Not PDAs. No one's using PDAs anymore. I wish. Smartphones, tablets, laptops, desktops, servers, cloud servers hosted at Amazon and Google Compute, Wi-Fi routers, electronic standalone voting machines, which usually have some sort of a computer inside of them, oftentimes running Windows, but not always. Wide variety of computer infrastructure that's used. Wide variety of number of operating system that's used, which means in any given polling location, you could have a dozen or more easily, even at not a large polling location, of connected computer equipment running maybe some Linux here, maybe some Windows there, maybe iOS, maybe Android, maybe a custom embedded OS over there, all with their own list of known common vulnerabilities and exploits that can be used to hack into any one of them, either locally or remotely, either before they got to the site or when they were already on the site at the polling location. Just as an example, just a few weeks ago, back in September, end of September, this brand new exploit came out of nowhere that impacted Linux, right? This Linux system, Linux servers, Linux desktops, and laptops, all sorts of machines, including some from Google, like Chromebooks and whatnot, where if you had a network connected printer with 9 out of 10 different types of configurations, your machine was now open to what's known as a remote code execution exploit, meaning someone remotely could very easily, with knowing very little about your computer, run code on your computer. Now, that's a bad thing when we're talking about storing, cataloging, presenting information related to votes. That's real bad. And you multiply that by the total number of machines that are at each polling locations times the 100,000 plus polling, you've got millions of attack vectors, millions, with a huge variety of known exploits. And those are just the known exploits, not including the human exploits and the unknown exploits that are out there, and the phishing attacks and the intentional attacks, right? Because you get one person, one out of the million of poll workers who's like, you know what, I'm going to mess with this. One. That person with the right access could screw with an entire state's election in a big way, big way, extremely easily. You just don't have to be that smart to pull this off here. Now, so we've got huge number of targets. It's obviously crazy high value, right? Meaning there's a intense incentive to pull off these sorts of hacks. There are a ridiculous number of exploits available. I mean, realistically, think about it for a second. When you think about major high-profile websites and how often they get hacked with teams of people that are supposed to be securing them, and yet they get hacked by the regular, and we're expecting 1 million plus people volunteering their time, exhausted, relying on government workers to provide infrastructure across hundreds of thousands of locations and millions of devices, they're not going to screw one thing up? Well, of course they are. Of course they are. Even if it's not intentional, even if it's not malicious, there's going to be an exposed attack vector in every single location, many of them. And the hacks will occur because people are motivated to do so. And what's crazy about this is most of the time that this occurs, we won't know about it. To maybe bring something up here. This is I got this from jhalderm.com, but there was a study done on voters detecting malicious manipulation of ballots, right? And this was done out of the University of Michigan, the Harker School. And I won't go into the full details of it because it's a giant study from a school, but what they found was when when printed out vote ballots were printed out from a machine after someone voted and they were wrong, intentionally wrong, like the machines intentionally printed them out wrong, 81% of the time, those errors did not get reported to the poll workers. So either the people didn't notice or they didn't care. So people generally don't report these things. So at least 81% of the time, we don't find out when the errors are occurring and they're right in front of people's faces. Now, how likely are people to report the error when they're not right in front of your faces, right? When they're just encoded in a barcode that you can't read because you're not a robot, right? How likely is it that those errors are going to be reported or even ever found out about? Extremely unlikely. And if someone does figure it out, how likely are they to shout it from the rooftops? Extremely unlikely. And I'm going to give you an example here. A little over a month ago, one of the most popular websites on earth got hacked, the Internet Archive, with the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine, right? That we all use to catalog and look at what websites looked like back in 1997, right? I mean, it's one of the most popular sites on earth. They got a massive hack at the end of September, massive, where millions, tens of millions of user records were dumped and leaked out. The hackers continued to have full access running rampant inside the Internet Archive. And they didn't tell anybody. They knew about it. The Internet Archive knew about it and told no one for almost 2 weeks. Yep. And that was what they did for their users that they love so much. You think every hack that goes off, or whether it's malicious or just a screw up, you think these election workers or government workers are going to shout it from the rooftops and fess up to it immediately? No, they're not. Most of the time when these hacks occur, the public does not find out about them. Most of the time. In fact, the only reason the public even found out about the Internet Archive hack is because the hackers themselves told everyone. Right? So that's kind of what we're facing with a hack of our voting apparatus within the United States, is unless people brag about it, or the hack is so clumsy and so butchered that it's just impossible to ignore, right? Meaning the hackers were dumb. We're not going to know about it. That's just the fact of the matter. There's no way around it here. And despite all of this obviousness, you'll still have people like ABC News and many others shouting that there is no way to hack voting machines. Oh my gosh, it's so super duper secure. They are so hard to hack. ABC News has literally got, in the days before the election fact check. How voting machines work and why they're hard to hack. Experts explain why the US election process has many checks and balances, right? So they're already coming out and telling you that no, there's going to be no hacking. That's not a possible thing. During the last election, during the 2020 election, it was the most secure and most wonderful election process ever. Well, come on. There was hacking. There was hacking in the election before that. There was hacking in the election before that. It doesn't even matter who won. There was hacking. It doesn't necessarily mean that the candidates themselves were sitting there doing hackings with Angelina Jolie and Matthew Lillard, but there was hacking being done by someone somewhere during the election on these voting machines. It's happening. Now, to what extent that modifies the outcome of the election, to what extent that screws with everything, unknown. But does that mean that you can count on the validity of the election when it comes out? Well, no, it means you cannot. It means fundamentally you cannot. This is all far too hackable. All of it, every last little drop of it is far too hackable. Now, many people have been talking about ways to remedy this. And one of the things that comes up repeatedly is that many of these machines involved, from the electronic voting machines to the ones that print out the ballots, to the ballot counting machines, to the software and services used to tabulate the votes, they're almost always proprietary software. But there have been a few, like there's an article up early this year from technologyreview.com that talked about how open source voting machines could boost trust in U.S. elections. Secretive legacy vendors are being challenged by Voting Works, a tiny nonprofit that publishes every line of code powering its machines. And this is a real thing. The problem is having open source voting software packages, and these are all server-based, desktop-based, web-based, embedded systems. They're all over the map from a wide variety of vendors, open and closed. But the fact that they move from closed to open only fixes some of the problems. The reality is that like we saw with that printer exploit I mentioned earlier, that was entirely open source. So that doesn't secure the system. It does, however, make things auditable. It makes sure that no shenanigans is going on in the original code. It doesn't mean that the code wasn't modified. It doesn't, in fact, it makes it easier to modify the code to do something different. It doesn't mean that the systems running aren't easily hackable. It just means that you can audit the code, which I think is overall a positive thing when we're talking about elections, and I'm certainly for it. But you'll note that most polling locations are not using these open source systems. So not only are the systems vulnerable to attack, but they're not even auditable. We cannot audit the code as the populace. We have zero control over how our votes are being handled, how that data is being transmitted, all of it. We have no control over it whatsoever. It's just not a doable thing. And it's disappointing, to be sure. There's been a huge number of examples of problems that have occurred. Many of the problems that do occur within these electronic voting systems are not necessarily even malicious. I just want to draw your attention to this case out of Pennsylvania. This is from Northampton County, Pennsylvania, from November of 2023. Northampton County has a total population of around 300,000 and around 200,000 registered voters. Northampton uses the Express Vote XL, the EVXL. It's a big old touch screen that prints out the devices, right? So it's not a fully electronic voting system. People do the vote on the touch screen, and that touch screen is fed in actually from a JSON file. It's a little configuration file, and they vote on the touch screen, and it prints out it prints out their ballot, and the ballot has a barcode on it that they can use to then go scan in their vote, right? So every time their vote is counted, it just has to scan the barcode, and then all the data gets added in. And so then you've got a paper trail for the ballot, right? Very logical. Now, Northampton, and this is just one location, right, within Pennsylvania, had, as of 2019, around 300 Express Vote XL machines, around 300 of them. And you can imagine, you multiply that by how many people you can crank through in a day, that handles a lot of votes. However, their first round of using this resulted in screen calibration issues that prevented the voters from voting how they wanted, meaning they couldn't touch the people they wanted to vote on the screen. That's annoying. But far worse, it incorrectly assigned votes during scanning and tabulation, meaning both every time it was scanned in and the final tabulation, it just screwed the numbers up. The EVXL reported 0 votes. This happened multiple times for some candidates who had votes. Many of those candidates that they reported 0 votes for went on to actually win the election. So that's how screwed up it was. Someone was winning and it gave them 0 votes, right? So the systems were just fundamentally buggy as all get out, right? You can't even attribute that to maliciousness. That's just downright bad code, right? Just going to scroll down a little bit here because it gets worse. After a few years later, back in 2023, when they did another round of tests on it, they had a test vote where you could vote for 2 different judge seats, right? Here's do you want to appoint this judge, and do you want to appoint this judge? It's a yes or no for either appointment, okay? Now, if a voter voted yes for both of those appointments, it worked. If a voter voted no for both of those appointments, it worked. If a voter voted yes for one but no for another, it looked fine, but in the barcode, it reversed them. So the one you voted yes for, it voted no on. The one you voted no on, it voted yes for. And you weren't necessarily going to catch that. And even if you did, even if it was visible to you, which most of the times these errors come up and it's not necessarily visible to you, again, roughly 81% of the time, when an error occurs on a ballot, even if it's right in front of their face, they don't report it because they don't necessarily see it or they don't care. 81% of the time. That's crazy. Again, that's out of the University of Michigan. It's crazy. It's crazy that is that is the case. Absolutely nuts. So here we go. We've got many of the machines that are electronic voting machines are woefully out of date. They are a lot of times running Windows machines, versions of Windows that aren't currently up to date with getting their latest patches and whatnot. And even if they were, there's still exploits for them. And these hacks are going to occur. There's not really anything that's going to stop it. I want to make a couple other quick points. As you're watching the votes come in and as shenanigans inevitably ensue, there's going to be states that will do recounts. Now, a lot of times when they say we're going to do a hand recount of the votes, what that means in many cases is they're going to do the exact same process over again that got them the first result. So when they say hand recount, they don't mean, not all the time. Sometimes they mean this, sometimes they don't. But a lot of times what they mean is they're not going to pick the ballot up, look at it, and mark something down. No. Not going to be human. Not going to be human interaction there. They're going to stuff a bunch of ballots into those optical scanners just like they did the first time and recount them. That gets called a hand recount because they're picking it up by hand. Now, because of this, I want also everyone to bear this in mind. Because of how astoundingly automated these systems are. Again, we went through all those details there. Where's the numbers? Roughly 80% are all using optical scanners that can crank out such a huge number of votes and tabulate them. They're spitting them all out using proprietary, usually web cloud-based infrastructure, which, yeah, that's not hackable, wink, wink. That it happens so fast that you should be able to count every vote in even the most populous states in the country in a matter of a couple hours. at most. Any state that goes longer than that, there's something else going on. Either they're confused about how the system works, they don't know what they're doing, they lost the votes, they can't find them, something's afoot, or they're intentionally going slow. Again, there are no states in the United States that lack the equipment to process the votes in anything more than a couple of hours. They should be able to do it in just a few hours. Every single state, from New York to California to Florida to Delaware to every single one of them. They should be able to crank them on out. If you notice any states that are going extraordinarily slow, there's a reason for that. Something's broken, something's not working, something's hacked. Someone is intentionally slowing things down. That simply is the case. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean something nefarious is happening. It just means something's going wrong. If that's the case, the more things that go wrong, the more opportunities to hack these systems occur. And the integrity of those votes goes down essentially with every second that it is not counted. That's just the way it works. So I want to put that out there. And once again, any news outlet who's telling you this is the most secure election ever, it's so gall-darn secure, it's unhackable, they're lying to you. They're not telling you the truth. So ask why. It's really, really important that we ask why, because it's a very strange thing to suggest that it's not hackable. All right. That's what I wanted to make sure was in everyone's heads. Again, it's November 4th. November 5th is election day. We'll see how right I am. Now, we won't know. Again, I don't want to make this clear. We won't necessarily know what all hacks happen. Because again, look at the case of the Internet Archive. They got hacked. 31 million users' data got breached in really significant ways. Personal information, everything. Hackers got all of it. The Internet Archive didn't tell a soul. Right? They didn't tell anyone until the website was brought down and the hackers screamed from the rooftop how great of a hack they pulled off. And they even went to a website that catalogs hacks and says, hey, we did the hack. Here's all the data we got. They were bragging about it. It's the only reason we even knew. If they don't have a motive to tell us, they won't tell us. But the hacks are going to happen no matter what. I think this prediction is pretty solid here. I can't think of a scenario where we don't get crazy hacked tomorrow. If it hasn't already happened, and it probably has. All right. Thank you to the Lunduke Journal subscribers at lunduke.com. You can subscribe to the podcast a bunch of different ways. You can subscribe to the podcast and Apple and Spotify and RSS feeds. And you can watch the video version on the YouTubes and the X and the Rumble but the Locals. The Locals is great. Watching the video over on Locals is nice. Never get any commercials. Very, very good. I like that a lot. And if you want to support the work of the Lunduke Journal, make sure you subscribe there over at Locals. You also get the articles and everything else. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, nerds and nerdettes across the inner tubes, I do declare, end broadcast.